Good afternoon. This is Dyke Hendrickson, host for the weekly podcast, Life Along the Merrimack. I am the outreach historian for the Custom House Maritime Museum, and we talk about the health and history of the Merrimack River. With me is Jared Eigerman, a city councilor who was recently elected by fellow councilor as president of the council. Jared, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Each year, the 11-member council elects a president. For more than a decade, Tom O'Brien from Ward 6 was president. And then Barry Connell spent a short time in that position. You were recently put in that position just a few weeks ago. How does that happen? Did you let it be known that you were interested, or did some people approach you and say, you know, do you want to express some leadership here?
It's sort of the quintessence of inside baseball, because it's not something that goes on an agenda. It's the internal workings of the council. Really what happens is everybody's obsessed with the election. You get through the election and then you start to think about, okay, well, who's going to be the president and run the meetings. I'm now going to my 7th year, and I don't know how much longer I'll serve. I enjoy the job, but you never know, and I always wanted a chance to preside. So I did it on my own. I went to a couple counselors and asked them what they thought. I then, of course, went to Barry Connell, who was the incumbent, and told him what I was up to. And, you know, we're friendly. So, I reassured him not much was going to change. The committee assignments are not radically different. And he and I have served together all these almost 7 years. So, and then it's about counting, it's
and it was 6-5.
It was 6-5. I mean, I don't think I certainly didn't know I was going to be elected until the day of the meeting. It wasn't a foregone conclusion at all.
And what does the president do? I should tell the audience I covered the city council for the Daily News here in town for about 5 or 6 years. I must commend Jared on him being one of the few councilors that I observed who always read the packet. And the packet is something that's handed out during the week usually. The councilors can read it. And I remember sitting with Donna Holliday, in her office at one point, and she would, they'd be discussing something, and Donna would say, why don't they read the packet? All of these answers are in the packet. But anyway, I won't have you refer to the packet per se. But what does the president do? Do you set the agenda, or do you monitor the debate, or what happens?
Yes, both. I mean, so the... First, it's like the chair of any board, in the sense that you're administering the rules. I don't debate because you're meant to stay aloof of that. And I've been a very fierce debater these 6 years, but it's a different role. I still represent my ward, of course, Ward 2, in committee meetings and in writings, but I'm really supposed to stay up there behind the big desk and run the meeting fairly. So we actually had a special meeting on Saturday to go over those rules to make sure everyone understands what they are. When there's a question of order, the president makes a ruling on that. He can be overruled by a 2/3. That almost never happens. So we move them pretty smoothly. Let's get to the packet. Before the packet goes out to the councilors, I work with the city clerk as president to figure out what's going in the packet. But I want to make clear that it's not a situation like, say, Senator McConnell in the U.S. Senate, where the president can bottle up legislation and deny hearings. Our rules do not permit that, and that's quite conscious. Really no one answers to the president. Really, it's just to be the sort of arbiter in running the meetings. But I also am the liaison with the mayor. That's not a legal rule, a legal requirement, or even a rule. But as a practical matter, it makes sense to sit down with the executive branch once a week and get up to speed. And understand her priorities, and then I can communicate that to the council, mostly in open session. But if something's not before us yet, I can do it privately.
Well, one of the useful things about the council meeting is any resident can go there, and if they're concerned about something, they can sign on a list to say I'd like to speak tonight. And sometimes, frequently, there's just a few, if any. But I've been there when there were 20 or 25 people. So that is a time that I remember Tom O'Brien, would have to monitor. If you have 30 people there, he kept them moving along. And so everybody was heard. And I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, no, that actually, I hadn't mentioned the interaction with the public, but that's key. I mean, local government, unlike state and federal government, is where the rubber meets the road. All of us are really part-time. I mean, this is not a full-time job. Well, it's not supposed to be a full-time job to be a city councilor. We're very available, very reachable. Our email addresses and telephone numbers are posted on the website, the city website, and especially ward councilors, the 6 of us, and I'm still a ward councilor, as I said, we try to respond within hours, not days. And it's true that as long as it's something on our agenda, we want to hear from everybody. And to make that happen, you may not get a lot of time. It's not because it's formal. You have to come and take 2 minutes. But, that's your chance. You have the rapt attention of all 11 of us for those 2 minutes, and it's on videotape for posterity, too. Yes. So it is effective.
Well, you grew up in Newburyport on Fair Street, I believe.
That's right. Yeah.
In those days, when we talk about the river, was it swimmable in the 70s and 80s? Or
No. No.
What do you remember about the river in terms of when you were growing up?
Now, just to clarify, I mean, my parents moved here in 1968, so it was before redevelopment had kicked in, and they were still deciding whether to tear it all down or not. And I moved away. My parents were divorced, so I didn't stay here all through high school. I was gone in the 80s. I was not attending school here, but my grandmother lived on Spring Street, around the corner from us on Fair. She died on the island. My mother had property there, so yes, I have a lot of familiarity with the Merrimack River. Like any Newburyporter, I mean, it's kind of the organizing principle for our geography. Up the river, down the river.
Sure.
You're dealing with the river every day, all the time. When my parents moved here, it was terribly polluted, not just with sewage, but also industrial waste. I mean, the Clean Water Act didn't kick in until 1972. So there wasn't even any federal legislation for the first 4 years. So I can tell you, when we went down to the water, not only was there was no boardwalk, the tear down, the demolition was done that summer in '68 actually, so it was rubble, but it didn't smell very good. I'll be honest, it just was not attractive. I remember going to yacht clubs to watch yacht races as a little boy. That was fun, and then we'd go out the island on the ocean side, but we really didn't linger a lot on the river. Now, we were chatting before the show. There was still a healthy sports fisherman industry here. There were, Tournament Wharf was very active in the 70s, and but people would go out the harbor mouth, and they were not sticking around.
Right.
So, I mean, long story short, there are more boats here in Newburyport in the summertime than I've probably since 1810.
Yes. And so it has, we always talk about this, Ed Muskie and Ted Kennedy was around too, were instrumental in the Clean Water Act in 1972. It cleaned up the main rivers, which Muskie was familiar with, but also the Merrimack and many rivers around the country were greatly aided. Nowadays we're concerned from sewage discharges upstream, and this occurs frequently when rainwater mixes with the sewage in the sewage treatment plants. The plant overflows, and the plants do have federal approval to have these discharges because they just can't take anymore.
Right.
But Newburyport and also Amesbury and Salisbury have been pretty good citizens in the last decade or two. We have, improved our treatment plants, and we're doing pretty well. We don't discharge when things happen. But my question to you, Jared, is there a way that is there a way that other larger cities, Haverhill and Lowell and Lawrence and all the way up to Manchester, can be prevailed upon to, say, hey, let's make a program to clean this up? Or do you think there might be federal money out there as there was 4 or 5 decades ago?
Well, the irony of all this, of course, is that cleanup of the Merrimack is exactly what my mother worked on in the early 70s. So she started at the Army Corps of Engineers, and then she was at the Merrimack Valley Planning Commission when they built the plants. So she helped get the plant built in Salisbury and upstream. The problem is there was federal money then to build those plants, and no one really has touched the upstream plants so far as I can tell since. We had the state delegation into us. They had met with Mayor Holliday, and then they met with us right afterwards a couple of weeks ago, Representative Kelcourse and Diana DeZoglio. And this was exactly this line of questioning we were giving her, and Jim. You know, they're in a tough spot because the senator's been very active, especially in getting legislation for flagging, which is both literal and metaphorical, to alert people when there are these discharges. But she has no way politically or practically to compel the upstream cities, Haverhill, Lowell, and Lawrence, to do better. And we're the plaintiffs, I would put it that way, to be blunt, at the end. Newburyport suffers the most. Right. It all ends up here. I'm skeptical that there will be a political solution without litigation, to be honest.
Those individuals you mentioned are part of the team that started a river commission.
Yes.
And they meet every couple months to talk about what can be done. There seems to be a coming together for many individuals in the Merrimack Valley. Can this have a cumulative effect in the sense of, you know, starting some kind of political action to drive something?
I think so. And I want to, I've done it before, I'll do it again. I want to give credit to our state delegation for the work they've done. And in fact, they've gone across the state border, and they're trying to get Hooksett and Nashua and New Hampshire cities involved too, because of course the problem doesn't stop at the border, even though they have no jurisdiction up there. So yes, I do think it's worthwhile. I don't mean to denigrate those efforts. I'm just saying that they're probably a necessary condition for a solution, but not sufficient. That it will show that it's an important issue, get people organized, and then we have to lobby Washington. I think the fact is, the amount of money that's involved to fix the problem is more than a state can handle.
Well, Hooksett, New Hampshire is well remembered by many in Newburyport because 5 or 6 years ago they had a sewage treatment plant, and they had these experimental little rings that were supposed to fit into these elements and hold back the sewage. But one weekend they overflowed, and I remember this because I was with the paper. The initial remarks from the Hooksett people were maybe a couple thousand have gotten out. Then it was a couple 100,000. Now I've heard actually closer to 1 million, and have been found in Portugal and Spain. So that was one moment of sewage treatment history around here that certainly lingered. But in terms of Lori Trahan has been, and Seth Moulton and others, I think, have been active on the federal ground of play here. Do you hear anything that there could be, or does it maybe depend on the upcoming election in November?
Well, I'm too early as the president. I'm trying to get connected with the help of our state delegation with the federal delegation, so I can ask. I'm sure the mayor has already been lobbying them as well. But yes, I mean we are dependent on our reps to help us here. If they're not making noise in Washington, I don't know what hope we have. So I have not met with them. I don't have any firsthand knowledge. But for Newburyport, I can't think of a federal issue that's more important. I can try, but I don't think I'll succeed.
You talked about erosion on parts of Plum Island as a concern here in town. And I covered it, as I say, for 5 or 6 years. Are there still homes on Plum Island that are vulnerable? And where do we stand with Reservation Terrace and elements that people are trying to improve down there?
The two experts on that would be the Ward 1 councilor, Sharif Zeid. He represents the island, the Newburyport portion, which is about a third of the residents there. And the mayor, and she had debriefed us recently. Yes, there are many homes in danger on Reservation Terrace. As you know from covering it in the paper, or anybody who really has been out there, and you look at the sand, it's alarming. There's not a lot of sand left. and there aren't great solutions. The concern on the city side is not just individual residents on Reservation Terrace losing their homes, but it's the water and sewer system, because the lines that were put in 15, 20 years ago are a little too close to the erosion line for our feeling, and we don't have a plan. I mean, I'm not aware of any emergency plan if it's breached. And we probably should come up with one. What happens if they breach? I don't know. And it's one of those things where it's not unlike, sort of the combined storm overflow problem in Lowell, where it's just so massive they don't want to deal with it. It's too horrible to conceive of. We kind of have that situation with a breach of our utilities out on the island. We need to think of that.
3 or 4 years ago, the North Jetty and the South Jetty, they were both fortified, made taller. And I remember the Coast Guard said this is for navigation. They didn't really address the tides, or they didn't address erosion. And some of the officials actually said, in a forthright way, erosion is not our concern. We're talking about navigation. Is there a consensus at this point if the jetties enhancement at that time have helped or hurt, or maybe it helped part and hurt another part?
There was I was away during the holidays, but there was a presentation given by an expert in this field. I think it was December 27th. Councillor Tontar attended that, and so I got his account. I also got an account from the chairman of our resiliency committee, a man named David Chatfield, who lives in Ward 2. All things being equal, and from talking to the mayor, the jetties are a good thing. They are not purely harmful, because, in fact, a lot of the North Point really wouldn't exist without that South Jetty. So, yes, I realize there's some concern about the ability of sand to get through, to keep going as it migrates south down the shore. But it isn't just that we need the harbor mouth not to move, which is important for the rest of us landlubbers in Newburyport, not just islanders, but also it does have a positive effect, those jetties. It's not all bad, is what I understand the science has found.
That meeting that you mentioned drew 195 people to talk about the jetties and erosion. So, the coast and Plum Island is very much on the minds of people in town.
Oh, yeah.
In terms of development here in Newburyport, Waterfront West, which is on the riverfront, was proposed several years ago. And that is in that open area between the Old Black Cow and Michael's. It's about 5 acres. Where do we stand with that, Jared, in terms of, because that's, there have been numerous public discussions of that. And is there a plan now that you folks are looking at?
No, there's no current plan as of today, January 2020. I'd say there were two serious proposals by the landowner, separated by a couple of years. So in 2017, there was a proposal to do a series of buildings that were perpendicular to the shore, sort of in a finger plan, and that was scrapped. And then they came in again late 2018, and then we discussed it during 2019 for a parallel to the shore complex. The uses are the same that are proposed by the owner, New England Development, mostly condominiums, some hotel rooms, and a modicum of retail and restaurant. Really not a lot of retail and restaurant. It can't support it. But no, I really don't know where we go from here. I mean, I was the chair of the Planning Development Committee and was on the front lines there for trying to debate legislation. I'm no longer chair. It's now Chair Shand, Heather Shand, who also represents that ward. So I'm kind of pushing her as someone who may come up with the next idea. I will say there's a good segue from what we were just talking about with erosion and sea level rise. We really need a citywide ordinance on how to handle development on the riverfront, not just Waterfront West. We don't have that yet, and we need a comprehensive set of rules That's only fair to every landowner, not just Waterfront West.
Well, this is Dyke Hendrickson. I'm the host of Life Along the Merrimack. I'm talking to Jared Eigerman, who is the president of the city council now. He's also a real estate lawyer. And one of, as I recall the meetings I went to, sometimes your knowledge was very helpful in talking about zoning and in talk about what might be done. Was the Waterfront West area one time a low-lying area? I thought at one point it was classified as low-lying. And then three years ago or so, there was a reclassification. I've always wondered, particularly since we have a resiliency committee, we're very concerned about climate change and perhaps flooding. Is this a concern that this might be going into an area that was once low-lying and might be vulnerable?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that was in the work that we did starting in 2017. That was a focus of debate because the FEMA maps, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, changed in the last 10 years. So the expected floodwaters are higher and more frequent. Now, you can engineer around that. So the approach that was being taken by the developer really is no different than what I see in Boston. And I'm a real estate attorney, as you say. I represent developers only outside of Newburyport. And Boston has an even worse situation, I would say, than we do because so much of their city is fill. And a lot of my clients own property which used to be under the harbor.
Right. Yeah.
So they have come up with a plan. They have not codified it as zoning yet to deal with this issue, but essentially what you try to do is waterproof the first floor. I mean, that's what you're trying to do. And we talked about, well, what happens if there's a storm event? Where do people go? You need to think about that. But the whole design that NED, New England Development, had for Waterfront West, essentially there would be no residential space on the first floor. So there would be all the living area would be at 15 or 20 feet up in the air to plan ahead. You could make the argument that nobody should build anything in the floodplain. You could make that argument, but that's a very tough position to take and really not the approach in Boston or anywhere else. It's just not, if you look at the flood maps, almost all of downtown Newburyport is going to be underwater.
Right.
And there's just not enough money to move downtown. That's just not realistic. We're going to have to cope. We're going to have to find ways to cope.
They did talk about a hotel. I'm talking about New England Development now. And several of the hearings that I attended, they said, well, we may get to that. It may be one of the last things we do. Maybe this is a whimsical question, but could it be the first thing they did? I mean, could the council say a lot of people in our community would like to have a hotel, a small hotel? We feel it would help the merchants downtown. We feel people could stay 2 or 3 days instead of having a real hard time.
Yeah.
Is that possible to ask them about that?
It is. I mean, and that's what we had embarked upon in 2017 and again last year was there are two things going on. The developer needs zoning changes, if for nothing else, in order to build slightly higher than under the current zoning because of the floodplain problem. Right. Everything has to go a little bit higher up. Well, that's in our discretion. That's a legislative act. We don't have to allow the zoning to change. We could just keep it where it is. They actually have the owner has a vested right to the existing existing zoning because they recorded maps. But in any case, so it was a negotiation. And one of the things we were trying to get straight on the city council, what are our priorities as representatives of the public? What is it that we want to see as a public benefit in exchange? It's not for sale zoning, but it's an opportunity to shape the project. And a hotel was supposed to be, if not the first phase, maybe the second phase. But that was vital to us. That's really what the city thought it was getting out of it. Also, mitigation. Now, mitigation is supposed to be something that counteracts an impact. The development was going to have an impact on Merrimack Street and the intersection with Winter, Summer, and the bridge, the Bossy Gillis Bridge, which is Route 1. Another big ask that we were going to have was signalizing that for the first time. So since it opened in 1934, I don't think there have ever been any signals, and it's pretty awful. So that would be another thing. Hotel and signalization down there were things that the council had prioritized, but we never really got very far on that. There were no negotiations. There was no deal because the proposal on the zoning side of it collapsed.
Is there any possibility that New England Development would just get tired of the discussion and consider dropping the program? I remember I went to something across from Merson down on Merrimack Street, and a group was going to come in and build some apartments and commercial development, and a lot of people came out and said, we don't want this. And actually the developers said, well, if you folks don't want it, we don't want to get into a protracted argument.
Right.
And they actually pulled back on it. Have you heard anything like NED might lose interest?
I haven't heard any of that from NED, but that is absolutely possible. Again, this is what I do in Boston, and I did it in San Francisco for many years too, is it's a three-sided negotiation, really, land use development, with the government, the residents nearby, and the developer. The developer has to make it pencil. There's a minimum amount of development so they can get a loan, and the pro forma works. The government has various things they want, like, say, a hotel or transportation improvements, and the neighbors have their goals. And it is not like two private parties hammering out a contract. It's a very complex three-way public process. So I would not be surprised if the developer changed course, but I haven't heard that. I think this, realistically, is probably, they own quite a lot of property in Newburyport, but this is the best development site that they have where they could do something new.
Well, this is Dyke Hendrickson. I'm with Jared Eigerman. We're just about to wrap this up. And Jared, thank you for coming.
My pleasure.
You have great answers to the questions that I don't know the answers to. So thanks for that. But one of my lingering questions is, as a counselor for 6 or 7 years, what is the question you get most from people in town? Is it sidewalks, or is it schools, or when they say, geez, I've got a problem, can we talk about this? What do you hear from the regular folks, not the developers, the politicians?
I would boil it down to this. I think people, taxes have gone up and up and up in Newburyport, in part because the values have gone up and up and up. So it's not all bad news. Our home values have gone up, but it's the value that is received in return for those taxes. That's what griping is about, and that's normal. And I do it too. So, for example, people want to know, well, if I'm paying these taxes, how is Newburyport High School ranking in the state? Are we in the top quarter? Are we in the top third? On streets and sidewalks, why do our streets not look as good as they are in pick a town, Wellesley,
How's our
Winchester?
painting on High Street coming along?
Yeah, well, that's going to be
good. No one had anything to do with that except the construction folks, but that was a disappointment.
Well, I'm not going to. I don't want to get into details of that. Why? Because it's not in my ward, so I can just say, oh, it's not my ward. But yes, that absolutely is something where people say, I'm paying all these taxes. Right. Why can't High Street be paved and look nice? And that's a reasonable position. So I would say that's the number one thing. And I think the challenge on the city council is, ultimately we're making priority decisions. What do we fund? What do we not fund? And streets and sidewalks, the council has prioritized very highly. And that means there are going to be some other things we can't do because we want people to feel good about the taxes they're paying, that their streets are in decent shape. So that, in a nutshell, is what it's all about on the city council. What am I getting from my taxes? And when there's something visible that they use every day, like a street, there's a lot of frustration.
Well, I've got to say, the sign painting on High Street, it was so ubiquitous. You couldn't spend a day and say, what is going on here? Can't they paint anything correctly? Well, we have about a minute left, Jared. Maybe you could just mention a couple things that, you'd like to see happen with the council in this coming year.
I don't have any particular agenda. We have two new counselors and a third counselor who stepped in the last 3 months, so really three. Mm-hmm. And the way it works is, we're counting on fresh blood to have new ideas, new energy, So as a result, I is to get them really involved. So I'm looking forward to working with them in their committees.
And then this year, it's another summer. The pollution and the clean water is what we always talk about. There will be a sign system, rudimentary, perhaps 16th century with flags. But nevertheless, I think more boaters and fishermen will know that there's been a discharge upstream. So I'd like to thank you, Jared Eigerman, President of the City Council. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for
having me. This is
me.
Dyke Hendrickson. This is Life Along the Merrimack. And we'll talk again next Tuesday. Thank you.